This episode is brought to you in part by the Table Podcast from the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm Daryl Bach, one of the hosts, and I invite you to join us as we discuss issues of God and culture, which includes anything and everything. Listen on your podcast app or at dts.edu/the table.
Welcome to the Grace Enough podcast. I am your host, Amber Cullen. This week, I sit down with Steve Carter to discuss his season of learning to grieve after experiencing betrayal and disillusionment while serving as pastor at Willow Creek Community Church under Bill Hybels. Steve's story is one filled with grief, forgiveness, healing, and a hope in Christ that never faded. You can learn more about his story in his newest book, Grieve, Breathe, Receive, Finding a Faith Strong Enough to Hold Us. If you or someone you know has experienced spiritual wounds or been disillusioned by the church and are looking for resources and encouragement, visit graceenoughpodcast.com. On the homepage, click the question that reads, "Been spiritually wounded?" There you will find multiple podcast episodes and a list of resources. Good morning, Steve, and welcome to the Grace Enough podcast.
Amber, it's an honor to be a part, and thanks for having me.
Yes. And so, Steve, are you still podcasting with Craft and Character?
Yes. So we interview different authors and pastors on the craft of preaching and communication while always hoping that our character is leading the way.
Yeah. I think one of the very first episodes I listened to that is maybe when you had JP on.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Somebody shared it with me and I was like, oh, I've never heard of this podcast, and really, really enjoyed just some of the ways that he, the two of you really laid out how you prepare sermons and things. That was really, really helpful.
JP is like one of the best. He's just such a good man. I'm grateful for his friendship.
Well, and he's doing some incredible, God's using him to do some incredible work with college students right now. So that's really, really cool to see, as I'm someone who benefited from college ministry, like changed my life, and so it's really cool to watch what's happening with him. But I love to start my conversations with how people came to know Christ. Like, tell me a little bit of your early faith journey.
Yeah, so I didn't grow up in a Christian home, and my mom actually grew up in Queens, New York, moved to California, had me pretty young. And I think you could say that parochial schools are more preferred than some public schools in New York. And in California, depending on where you live, some of the public schools are actually better than the parochial schools. But my mom had it kind of in her head, like, my son's going to a private school. So I end up going to this private Christian school connected to a Christian church. It's like, feels like it's one of those schools that starts out in preschool, goes to, community college. She's just like in everything in between. And I was in 7th grade, and there were 2 juniors in high school. Their names were Dominic and Nathan, but they went by the name Dominate, which is just awesome. And
that is awesome.
Yeah. And they were the first guys that I actually saw something different in. I mean, they love sports. They were good guys. They were really, really funny. They were leaders. They ran for like ASB, like president and vice president. I mean, they were just the guys that you just would notice that something was different about them. And I wanted to be like them. Mm-hmm. And I remember playing basketball one day after school, and Dominic came up to me and said, "Hey, Carter, do you want to learn how to dominate life?"
Oh, wow.
And to this day, it's like one of the greatest questions anyone's ever asked me. And for the next 6 months, Dominic and Nathan, after school, once, twice a week, would take me to in and out and just discipled me. And 6 months later, I got baptized. And I'll never forget, Dominic just said to me, like, "Hey, now you got to go get your parents baptized." I was like, "What?"
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah. And my senior year, I got to baptize my mom. And my sophomore year of college, on my 19th birthday, I baptized my dad.
Oh my goodness. Praise the Lord. That's so awesome.
Yeah. So Dominic and Nathan, I always talk about them as like, just, they'll never know how much of an impact they had by just asking that one simple question and making time for a 7th grader who really needed a picture of what grace, peace, and hope was all about.
Wow. I mean, that blows me away because I work with youth. And I mean, that's just really rare. I hate to say it. Like, I mean, that is like
Yeah.
really rare, especially somebody who's like willing to do it week in and week out. You know what I mean? Like, take you. And so, did they just pick you up and y'all went and
Yeah.
had burgers and was conversation about Jesus or life or what?
Yeah, they were pretty subversive, to be honest. I mean,
Mm,
Dominic had a car, Nathan had a car, so they would do that. Pretty much, we'd always go to In and Out,
yeah.
which is where the Shekinah glory of the Lord descends in burgerly form. It's
All
best
you
hamburger ever.
Californians.
Right, it's right, it's right, it's right. And it's so good. But I felt like they would just ask me random questions, ask me about they might ask me, hey, are you interested in a girl? And okay, so why? Tell me about her. What is it about? And then they
Mm,
would like use that as a way to talk about, oh, what do you think it means to actually be someone
mhm.
who would be right for a girl? Like, and just they were almost
Gosh,
like
that's so awesome.
yeah, the Jesus judo trick kind of a little bit. And it just like, again, they made space. We'd go play
Mhm.
basketball on Saturdays, many
Yeah.
times during that 6 month run. And it just was like, they let me be with them
Yeah.
and
Wow.
they let me live in their orbit.
Hmm.
And I felt like a younger brother and I
So
wanted
cool.
what they had. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh man. I just love it. I absolutely love that because we do have a choice and sometimes our choices really change people's lives, whether for good or for bad, you know?
Well, I always tell people too, it doesn't matter who you are. You have five people that you can influence. It's
Hmm.
usually five people maybe you don't want to influence,
Yeah.
but here was two juniors who saw one of their five was a seventh grader and they made space for him.
Wow.
And I
Man.
think that's what I tell my son as well, is that he's going into a junior year in high school. I'm like, there are younger people who want to be around you. How are you stewarding that influence for good?
Wow. Yeah.
No.
Ah, that's awesome. I mean, and before we get into actually all the things we're here to talk about, so it sounds like you played basketball. Does your son play basketball too?
I know
Isn't it
he it
hilarious?
is. It
I
is.
asked that because I played basketball and my son is now, but forever I was like, he doesn't like sports at all. Like nothing, none, zero.
Totally. My son, he actually had like a better jump shot than I did, but just never felt like the love for the game like I did. I mean, I
Yep.
I played all the way up into college. Play's not the right word. I sat the bench but got free shoes. But I really had huge hopes. But my son's really into theater and does a bunch of plays and summer plays, and so it's fun to watch him stretch a muscle that I'm not very good at.
I
So
know. Well, and those can be a ton of fun. So I could talk
yes.
about that too, because I have three kids, so we're all over the radar when it comes to what we do. But
Yes.
it is just funny how kids can become so different than their parents, and you're like, whoa. I mean, that's not what I saw coming, but that's
Yes.
great.
Yes.
So okay, so tell me this. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about what you've written, but I want you to kind of set the stage for us by talking about what was going on in your life between the years of 2013, 2017. You were pastoring, you had mentors. Like, tell us what was going on in your life. What did it look like? And kind of what were your hopes during that time?
Yeah, so in 2012, I was pastoring in Southern California at a great church called Rock Harbor in Costa Mesa, California. And I got a phone call from Bill Hybels, who was the founding pastor at Willow Creek Community Church. And I had known him because his son-in-law was one of my closest friends on the planet. And during the summers, for the last number of years, I had been able to spend some time with him, ask him questions about leadership and ministry and preaching. And I'll never forget that phone call where I was when he kind of said, hey, over the last number of years, you've been looking for this, and
Mm,
this, and I'm here to offer you this, and this. Just give me one reason why you'd say no. And I was like, well, I need to talk to my wife first and pray about it. And so in the end, probably the summer of 2012, we moved to outside of Chicago to be a part of Willow Creek. And my first one-on-one meeting with Bill, he let me in on the succession process. And I was like, you're leaving? And he's like, well, I'm not leaving now, but I've taken like internally poll if anyone wants my job, and 4 of the staff actually want to put their name in the hat for my job, and I want to add your name to the list. And I'm like, hey, I just got here. I don't think that's a smart move at all. But he's like, pray about it. I came back. I said, hey, I don't think I should do this. And he said, hey, I'm not saying you're going to get this job, but you said you want to be developed. This is going to be an opportunity to be developed.
Mm.
And so just put your name in. And so I did. And I'll tell you, like, for the next like 6 months, it felt a little like the Christian Hunger Games. The succession
Really?
process was really shaped after uh, Jack Welch at GE and how he handed it off to Jeff Immelt. But there was 4 people who were like really competing for it.
Mm.
And so within like 6 months, 8 months, it was just me. And
Mm.
every single like meeting that I led, or every sermon I delivered, or every announcement I gave, or staff meeting that I shared in, I'd sit down and I'd hear or get an email that was good for succession or that wasn't good for succession. And so it was about a 5-year process where my name, and then in 2016, another person's name was also added into the mix. That kind of surprised me at first. She was going to kind of lead out on a lot of the executive functions. I was going to lead out on kind of like content and congregation.
Hmm.
And in April of 2017, the elders approved Bill's recommendation for myself and this other person. It was announced on my 38th birthday weekend in October to the congregation. I mean, people were so excited. I'll never forget. It was almost like a living eulogy to hear a mentor speak over you of why they chose you and why they think you, and the congregation was just so affirming. And so it was kind of this like dream opportunity. I loved the values of Willow. I love the congregation. I love the Midwest. I'm a huge Big Ten sports guy, Michigan fan. I was serving with the Chicago Bears doing like Bible study. So like my life just made sense. And part of the Willow narrative was the founding pastor, Bill Hybels, had been mentored by Dr. B. And there was always this like legacy story of Dr. B pouring into Bill and Bill pouring into the next leader. And I had kind of dreamed in 25 years, I'd get to be a Dr. B for somebody else and pour into
Yeah.
them. And so I just was like, it reminded me of like the Dominate story. It just reminded
Yeah.
me of
Yeah.
older pouring into younger, older pouring
Hmm.
into younger. And I just, I saw my life there, and it was going to be awesome until it wasn't.
Well, was it hard though? Because you say it was a bit like the Hunger Games in the sense of, was that like succession feeling ever just an amount of pressure that kind of drove you crazy? Or are you the kind of person where honestly, like my husband can kind of actually thrive under that when it's healthy, if it can be healthy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I had to learn.
Mm.
So I think I'm naturally driven, probably the athlete, the kind of achiever I am, to like rise to the occasion or die trying. I
Mm.
just I'm gonna figure it out. I'm gonna do this. I think the other side of it is I knew the bill was for me, which I
Mm.
think was really, really helpful. But I also knew like I didn't come here for him to be like my best friend. I came here to be developed. And so it's almost like, you don't go to Alabama to play football when Nick Saban was there to be like Nick Saban's best friend, right? Nick Saban's there to
Or to
make you
be
better.
patted on the back and make
Ex-
you feel like a teddy bear.
exactly, exactly. And so I think what I really longed for was a coach. And people can say whatever they want to, but about
He was a
Bill,
good
but
coach.
he was a good coach. I mean,
Hmm.
he could break down how I taught. I didn't get to the point quick enough. Why did I pause here? Did I not know my line? Should I be manuscripting? Like he just was,
Mm.
uh, his verbal
Hmm.
precision and his tenacity was something that I really appreciated. And
Yeah.
it really, really made me so much better as a communicator and a leader on multiple fronts.
Well, I mean, that brings up a good point as we go into when things weren't awesome anymore. That, I mean, there's failures, and then we still have to acknowledge the gifts that people bring to the table. If we're talking about the image of God in man and all people, then that applies actually to all people. right?
Yes.
I mean,
Yes.
the goodness. But speaking of, so you're announced, you're excited, and the reality is, for those listening who may not know, it all came crashing down in 2018, and you made a difficult decision, which was to resign. And many people questioned that. Like, why didn't you keep going? Flesh that out a little bit for us. And then in 2018, like, were you completely floored when this came out, or were you kind of like, I'm not completely surprised?
Yeah. So 2017, we get announced. We go through and there's so much support. We end up doing like a capital campaign. We raised
Mhm.
like $3.4 million, which
Whoa.
just like in the sense of there was so much like energy. I gave a vision talk. It was like the first person ever that wasn't Bill to give a vision talk. And then people came and gave. It was like really, really powerful. So again, all of this momentum. We get to the end of the year, great Christmas run. It's like so
Mm.
exciting. And then I had been working on a manuscript called The Best of You that was about the relationship between Paul and
Mm.
Timothy almost having to like take this baton from Paul. And, scholars would refer to him as timid Timothy and just Paul having to like remind him who he is. And I was writing this as like a treatise in many ways to Bill. And in a way of just saying, hey, you've been kind of a version of Paul to so many leaders. And
Mm.
I'm like this little Timothy who's like, nobody knows, like stepping in. And so I just kind of broke down first and second Timothy and told some stories and thanked him for finishing well. I submit the manuscript, and my editor calls me and says, "Hey, have you thought about adding a chapter?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" Well, a chapter when someone doesn't finish well. And I was like, "Well, Paul finished well." And then in my
Oh,
mind, I'm like,
wow.
"Did you not like it?" And I start going back and forth with the editor, and the editor's like usually really, really clear, but is now feeling a little bit like peanut butter. Like I can't
Hmm.
I'm like just stuck. Like I can't figure her out right now. And then she just says, "You don't know about the story." What story?
Holy
The
cow.
story that's coming in the Chicago Tribune about a Chicago megachurch pastor and me too. And Amber, I'll be honest, I thought about a couple of other pastors. I didn't think about Bill. And I was like,
Ooh.
who is it? And she's like, it's Bill. I'm like, what? And then I just said, I have to go. I went and told the person who had been announced, and they had an inkling something might be happening. And I
Oh,
was like,
my.
what? And then the elders had been working through some stories that had been brought that had been really, really managed. And for the majority of the staff had nobody
No
even really
idea.
knew, no idea. And so
Mm.
that's how it kind of unfolded. And then within a month, the Chicago Tribune story comes out. And then within a month after that, Bill has got ahead of it, resigned early, retired early, whatever you want to call it. He
Hmm.
got out ahead of it. And then more stories just kept coming to the forefront. And in the end of June, I wrote a blog post that said, I believe the women. And everything had
Hmm.
really been done through social media
Hmm.
or through the newspaper. And I decided and I shared it with the elders and I posted my blog saying, I believe the women. And that kind of ruffled some feathers.
Hmm.
But then I started to kind of go, and I went a little rogue because as you start to go through these situations, what really messes with you is who can I trust? And you don't know if your discernment got leveled or if it leveled up. And
Mm.
I didn't know who was safe. I didn't know when I'm finding out elders knew and some staff knew that I'm like, why didn't I not know about the full extent
Yeah.
of this? Why? And then and so
Because
I
it's not
just
like you're even just a staff person at this point. Like,
right, right. And I had gone to Bill and I had had an honest conversation about all of this. And I had just felt like I had been like it minimized and pushed to the side and like
oh,
that, hey,
man.
this isn't true, da da da. And to be honest, I didn't want to believe it to be true.
Yeah.
I didn't, this wasn't good for what I thought my life was supposed to be. It messed with the plan. And so,
Yeah,
but I,
absolutely.
but you're kind of confronted with, do I have the desire to actually pursue the truth
Mhm.
or to maintain what I have. And I just went and started meeting with women and various people who had kind of brought stories to the forefront, and they were gracious enough to tell me. And as I started to hear the stories, I realized, oh my goodness,
Mhm.
this happened. And this isn't good. And I could just feel like my whole future crumbling. And so on August 5th, it was a Sunday morning, the weekend before the Global Leadership Summit, a New York Times story broke about Bill's former assistant. It had letters, it had pictures,
Yeah.
the details were pretty intense. And I just couldn't go on stage. I honestly couldn't go on stage and pretend like nothing had happened without honoring the truth. And I had already like presented the elders with 6 kind of postures that we as a church had, pride, but we need to showcase humility and repentance. And here's how we're going to do it with a specific
Mhm.
practice. And they kind of had pushed that to the side. But all of the women said if we did this, they would show up to the table. And so
Wow.
my whole desire was to try and like lead through this, call sin, move to a repentance and restoration and like really renewal for Willow and to be
And
the
they just
Willow.
said no.
And they said no. And then the story breaks, and I'm like, I just can't go and play church. And I realized I
Good for
had
you.
all of the trust with the congregation,
Mhm.
but no actual authority. I had all of the influence, no actual authority. I wasn't an
Mhm.
elder. So I had a view and a
Ah,
voice, but not a vote. And so that morning, I just said, I can't do this. I went home and
wow. Oh,
wrote a resignation letter. And some people have said, why didn't you just go on stage and resign on stage? Why didn't you say goodbye to the congregation? And I'm like, when you have 8 campuses, everyone's watching at a different time. Like I wanted it to be everyone to be able to hear it at the same time. There's no right way to do this.
nope.
There's no ultimate win. And the problem is like when the person who's responsible doesn't deal with it, it drops to the next person. And when they don't deal with it like in the right way, it drops to the next person. And when they don't deal with it, it drops to the next person. I feel like I was the 4th person,
Oh,
but the
man.
person that was like, I have to do this for the sake of trust and the sake of the church. So,
Yeah. Wow. There are so many things that I want to dive into, but I'm not going to because it's really not. It's mainly because I think as someone who is not a full-time staff person at a church, but a part-time, it's really hard for people to understand what you just talked about, having influence, but not having authority, to understand what it's like to have to deliver something like you needed to deliver, but you didn't have the power to do it the way that you thought would be best.
yeah.
It's really, really hard for somebody who's not on the staff or in that culture to understand that you don't just get to just do it.
This is a paid message from Celebrating Around the Table, a new one-of-a-kind cookbook from Harvest House Publishers and best-selling author Trillia Newbell. Trillia invites your family to gather around your table to learn more about the lives of 12 notable people whose compelling stories bring perspective to the Black Christian experience in America. Along the way, enjoy a taste of Southern Black American cuisine with delicious homemade recipes, many from Trillia's Mama's Kitchen. Each chapter features a biographical sketch of a noteworthy Black Christian, including firsthand accounts of their experiences, engaging discussion questions for adults and children, prayer prompts, and hearty recipes representing traditional Southern Black classics such as meatloaf, jambalaya, and black-eyed peas, complete with side dishes and desserts to complete tasty and memorable meals. Celebrating Around the Table is available wherever books are sold, or visit trillionnewbell.com to learn more.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, it's like people when they don't know all of the steps you took behind the
That's
scenes,
right.
and so it ends up, and again, like I remember one time Carly Fiorini she used to be like CEO of HP, and she ran for president. And I
Oh
had the
yeah,
chance
yeah,
to
yeah.
hear her speak one time. I asked her a question, and I said, "Hey, well, whenever you're going through transition, what can you tell us about what a staff or a board or,
Mm,
you know, consumers are thinking?" And she's like, "That's easy. It doesn't matter how emotionally intelligent, spiritually deep people are or brilliant that they are. The first question every person is going to ask in the midst of transition is, what does this mean for me?"
mm.
And so I think like what happened is a whole bunch of people are like, they didn't see this coming. They didn't want to believe this to be true about their church. They didn't want to believe this to be true that with Steve's leaving, now this must really be true. Like all of that, and they can't get to Bill and they can't get to the
Mhm,
elders, but on social media they can get to me. And so
mhm.
they're having to kind of create and conjure up some puzzle, but they don't have all the pieces.
Yeah,
And then our brain just creates meaning making moments where we just, well, someone's got to be the bad guy. Someone's got to have done this wrong. Someone's got
yeah,
to have abandoned. Someone's got to have hurt. And I get it. I really, really get it. I have empathy for it. And yet it's still hard. It's still really,
yeah.
really hard.
It is hard. It's just there's a lot of layers, and
Yeah.
I mean, we want answers, and when you that's the thing too about church is churches so often become your people. Like those are your friends, and your life is so I hate to use the word consumed because some people think that sounds cultish, but if you think about it, no matter what community you're in, it becomes that way. If you decide to invest, whether it's a church or somewhere else, but then when your heart is broken and you feel like I've been totally deceived, there's just an element there where we just can't not place blame. I mean, we just can't avoid trying to figure out all the pieces because it feels like, how did this happen without us having any clue?
Yeah, that's so good. Well, and I think a lot of the mega church movement, and I don't have shade on the mega church, so please know that. But I think a lot of it was built on the idea that this is like our own little city. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so in the sense of like, we serve here, we attend
Yep.
here, our closest friends are here. Like this is our city set up on a hill,
I know.
and here's what we do. And so I think like, I don't necessarily need to know my neighbors because
I
I know
know.
I know the people who sit in my row and in my section. And so just this kind of like perceived like this is my tribe, my people. And then I think too, there's probably a handful of things that Christians, evangelicals never want to be. I think one of the ones at the very top is to be tricked.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
they don't like to be wrong, but they more than not wanting to be wrong or not being in control is to be tricked. And when
Mm.
they get tricked, that deceiving sense of like, oh my goodness, like I got
Mhm.
played. People don't know how to sit in that because
Mhm.
betrayal trauma is a deep,
Mhm.
deep hurt and wound. And so I think that is one of the pieces that many of us don't necessarily have the spiritual muscle to lament and grieve and
Mm.
really sit with.
Yeah. As you're speaking, I mean, you're basically saying like, yeah, I wasn't shielded. Resigning didn't shield you from hurt and people lashing out. And so during that time of transition, and we're going to talk a little bit about what you heard the Lord say to you and how that has become the title of your most recent book. But during this transition, in the beginning, what were some of the hardest things? And really, how did that impact your journey with Jesus? Because I think a lot of us don't realize, we're still trying to walk with Christ during some of this deception. And that can be hard too, because we start asking, like, wait, Lord, why did this happen? Did you let this happen? Was this my fault? All these things. So what were some of the hardest things that you had to process during your transition?
It was hard for people to know that I left. I mean, there's one moment
Mm,
where I was at a Starbucks with my son who was in fifth grade at the time, and the Starbucks was packed, and I just was, ordering a drink, and I would walk into a place with my head down, just try to get the drink, get out, and a lady came up to me and just started yelling at me in front of this crowded Starbucks. My son grabs my hand. He looks at her, looks at
Oh
me,
my
looks at
God.
her, looks at me. And I just had to like take it. And I just say, hey, thank you for sharing your honest feelings. And I'm sorry you feel that way. And I wish you knew the whole truth. And I just walked out. And my son's always been an old soul. I feel like he came out of the womb in a
Mm.
cardigan. And he just was like, Dad, you always told me that if you did the right thing, you would be
Mm.
rewarded. So you either didn't do the right thing or you lied to me because that didn't feel like a reward, what that woman said. And I'll never forget, like God just like gave me something, and I can even just feel that like conversation in that moment just in my body. But like I can remember like God just reminding me that, and I looked at Emerson and I said, hey bud, remember when mom was pregnant with Mercy? She threw up multiple times a day. It was terrible. It was such a hard pregnancy. But when she held Mercy for the first time, it was all worth it.
Yeah, that's the
I
reward.
don't know how long it will be till we hold our version of Mercy. And
Mm.
I hope it's soon. And we're in the vomit stage right now. But I'm
Mm.
telling you, the God I know, it's going to be worth it. And he just looked at me and said, I hope so. And we drove home. But like I didn't want to go out. I didn't want
Yeah.
to open up social media. People just were telling me what they thought I should do or who they thought I was or what they
Oh,
what I wasn't to them. I mean, and here's the crazy thing. The athlete in me, um,
you want
I
to
I I
rebut, don't you?
I do, but I printed out all of what people said. I had a binder for the longest time because in my mind I was like, this isn't true. But
Mm.
I didn't want to forget it. But I think that the piece that I had to really wrestle with is around my identity. People ask me like, Steve, like similar to you, Amber, like, what about your relationship with Jesus? Did that get affected? And I'm like, no, like Jesus didn't
That's
let me
awesome to
down
hear.
at
Yeah.
all, at all. Jesus didn't do this, you
Yeah.
know? And then people are like, well, the church. And so many people who are deconstructing, and for a lot of them, I understand why and I get it, but they're like, the church hurt you. And I'm like, no, it didn't. Willow didn't hurt me. 5 people did.
Mm.
And my job was to actually ask myself, what am I going to do to prepare my heart for the day, if the day ever comes
Mm.
where reconciliation could be possible? And so I had to really go on a journey of learning how to forgive those 5 people and forgive them on the regular, to be honest.
Mm.
Um, but then I think the other side of it was around identity was you start to untangle a lot. Like, how did I
Yeah.
get deceived? How did I believe this? What did I believe about myself that wasn't true? And one of the things that I believed about me was I wasn't a leader.
Mm.
And, you know, as you start to untangle, my personality was, and this is like very, very dark. So stay with me for 1 second. At the most difficult point, I think I was like chosen because I was a good soldier. I really loved the congregation.
Mm.
I was paid really, really well. I mean, the church is probably $500 million in assets. There's a ton of influence. I think it was probably a good bet that I would never break from the storyline of Willow. I think people probably thought that because
Wow.
this is his job. And I think when I started to go, because I had been told I'm not a leader, I'm just a teacher. I'm not a leader, I'm just a teacher. And when I broke from that, it was almost like me having to step into, oh, this is like, you are this. But for many, many years, almost, I listened to this Christine Kane sermon and she taught on, you know, the questions God asks in the garden, you know, where are you? Or who told you that?
Mm.
And I had to really wrestle. Who told you you were not a leader? Did God say that? Or
Mm-hmm.
did someone that I had given so much power and influence to?
Mm-hmm.
And the truth is, that's on me. That's not on that person. That's on me that I received that, held that, believed that, lived out of
Mm.
that. And so part of the untangling was coming back to now who does God say I am?
Mm-hmm.
And who will I choose to be in view of that truth rather than some of the truths that I had believed because I had given people more credit or more influence than they probably deserved.
Wow. Because I'm sitting here thinking, like, who did tell you you weren't a leader? But you don't have to answer that. Um, well, because I mean, it's particularly when it's people in your life who do have influence, because it's true, that whole identity piece. Even as I work with like teen girls, they're so influential right now, and you just have somebody can say the tiniest little thing, and it will stick with them for so long, when that person, honestly, a lot of them never intended for their few words to stick with that teenager up and through their adult life, and have no idea the amount of influence that you had by just saying that one little thing. Now, some people can be nasty humans. That's not what I'm talking about. But you know what I'm saying? Like, it's amazing how sometimes that one little thing, you'll just believe it about yourself for
Yeah.
decades.
Yeah. I mean, I always will say that humans are very perceptive. They're just crappy interpreters of reality. So it's like what you
Oh,
perceive and then the stories or the meaning making that you create out of your perception is often when you kind of get yourself into a little bit of trouble if you don't properly interpret that that kind of a feeling or that word or that truth. And the second thing I would say is one of the ways that we talk about this often in our home is there's intent and
mm,
impact.
mm.
And when someone intends to hurt you with their words or their actions or not following through, and that impact is felt, ooh, that
Oh,
is a
yeah.
big wound. But oftentimes people don't intend to
Yep.
hurt you, but their impact is still felt. And so
That's
you've
right.
got to be able to discern, was this intended or was this an impact? Okay, now what do I do with that impact that I
Mm,
don't create more meaning behind it
hmm
that takes me off course from who I was always intended to be?
That's powerful. That's so wise. Well, you, on the morning after your resignation, you heard three words. And those three words were grieve, breathe, receive, which is what you've titled your book. And so share how those three words initially struck you. And then we're going to talk a little bit about each one. But how early on did you really feel compelled to follow those?
Yeah, so it was 5 a.m. The day after I resigned, we were in Madison, Wisconsin, because I knew that there'd be like news cameras at our house, and
Oh,
I just was
dude.
like, we got to get away. So I wake up, my a wife, my two kids are sleeping in the hotel, and I'm just, cortisol to the max.
Mm-hmm,
Like I'm
mm-hmm,
like, I don't have a job. I don't have a paycheck. I did not think this through. And so I'm
mm,
like, what am I going to do? And I just go for a walk and I'm in downtown Madison and I'm just begging God for a word. And I'm just walking, Lord, please give me something to
wow.
anchor in on. I don't hear anything. I sit down, I read the cadet's prayer from West Point. I'm hoping that maybe that inspires something. I don't hear anything. I go and I'm across from the Capitol building. I sit down at a bench and I'm like, please, God, just give me something. And in my kind of like spirit, these three words come out: grieve, breathe, receive. And I've had probably like less than a dozen of these kinds of moments where it
Mm-hmm.
just felt like different,
Yep.
weighty, sacred. And so I went to a donut shop and I just took out my journal and wrote, I have to grieve what is, grieve what I thought it was going to be, grieve how key people let me down. I'm going to
Mm,
breathe in new mercies, exhale bitterness and anger and resentment, and receive what I need to learn, receive what I need to own, and receive who Christ wants me to become in
mm,
this next season. And then that almost became this mantra for me. And again, we didn't have plans to move to the desert at that moment. But what I did realize is I knew how to achieve. I didn't know how to grieve.
mm-hmm.
And a few weeks after that, I felt like I got woken up in the middle of the night and God's telling me, go to the desert and wait for instructions. And I didn't think it was literal, thought it was metaphorical, and so,
I know
but
you're
as
like, I'm not Abraham.
yeah, exactly. So I, I, uh, I wake up the next morning, I'm making coffee, and I share this with my wife, and she tears up and she's like, I've been sensing the same thing. I want to go
Oh, wow.
home. And she's from
Mm.
Arizona. And so we moved there about 4 or 5 months after I resigned.
Wow.
And we kind of had this mantra: grieve, breathe, receive. We want to heal well as a family and we want to create beautiful things. That was kind of our triangle of like, this is what we're going to do as we wait for greater instruction in the desert season. So,
Wow.
yeah, that's kind of it.
Wow. So tell me this with grieving. You had this wilderness season, you're grieving. What did it look like for you, that process? And then why do you like, how are you encouraging people in what you wrote to really embrace that grief instead of just rushing through it?
Yeah. So I was hiking one morning and this book isn't just about Willow. I mean, 8 months after I resign, my dad dies.
Yeah.
And so I lose like a spiritual father and an earthly father in less than a
Mm.
year. It's just and a bunch of things just start to unravel. But I'm hiking one day and I'm one of those people, if I have a biblical framework, it helps make my life work. And I just was praying and I was thinking about grieve, breathe, receive. And all of a sudden, the thought of Holy Weekend hit me
Mm.
as Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Like, this wasn't fair. Friday, what Jesus went through. He's a perfect
Mm.
man. This wasn't right. This wasn't
Right.
okay. This wasn't fair. And if you think about Silent Saturday, the disciples don't believe or actually understand that Sunday's coming. They're
Mm-hmm.
just like, oh, what are we going to do? How do we get through this? What's going to happen to us? Is what happened to him going to happen to us? Like
That's
you
right.
can just imagine all of the uncertainty and worry, and then the surprise of Sunday. Didn't see it coming. And so what I began to realize is in the grief journey, Friday and grieving is when you are just in it. You are in grief. And my definition for grief is honoring what comes up when change shows up.
Mm.
Whatever the change is, how do I honor it and honor where I currently am?
Mm-hmm.
And what day of the week am I? Am I in Friday? Am I in Saturday? Am I in Sunday? But when you are in Friday, you are in it. It actually happened. You have to name it. You have
Mm-hmm.
to sit with it. And so that's part of the grief experience, is being in change and really, really honoring those feelings.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, and it's interesting because even Saturday, when I think of that, you have all kinds of emotions, right? You can have grief, you can have panic, you can have fear, you can have, and
Yeah.
that's what's beautiful. Those things don't have to, the quicker we can all understand that those things don't have to happen separately, but most of the time they're happening like cyclically, I think the better off we are.
Yes, yes, totally. Well, and that's the beautiful piece. And in the book, I have like this drawing that is like circular with change in the center, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, but it goes backwards or forwards,
That's right.
because you could have a moment where you are, you think you're in Saturday, and then all of a sudden you open up Twitter and you're like, oh, I'm right back to Friday. You have these memories right back there, But I think with Saturday, if you think of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, well, in the Hebrew scriptures, it's kind of like Egypt, the desert, promised land. It's kind
Mm,
of the
mhm,
same kind of
mhm.
story. And I remember being in Jerusalem, seeing a rabbi and walking up to the rabbi and saying, hey, rabbi, question. Egypt, the desert, the promised land, three primary environments in the Hebrew scriptures. In a person's life, random question, how much time do you think they spend in each of those three environments? And the rabbi looks at me and goes, you Americans are so funny. You think everything is up and to the right. Not us. He's like, we think 10 to 15% of your life is in Egypt, 10 to 15% of your life is in the
Mm.
promised land, and the remaining 70 to 80% of your life is in the desert. And if you think about the
Wow.
Hebrew story, is like when they leave Egypt, they're a month's journey from the promised land, and it almost takes them 500 months of just wandering, right? And
Uh-huh.
I think every single one of us, when we are in the unknown, uncertain, I mean, it's like COVID all over again, where we
Oh
just
my.
find ourselves just going, just let me bypass this. Let me just bypass the suffering, bypass the desert, bypass because my relationship with liminality and waiting,
Mm.
I hate the wait. I'm going to waste the wait. Like, just get me past this. And we don't know that when we don't lean into the wait, we don't lean into it and see it as an opportunity to grow. We just prolong our wandering to
Mhm.
get to the surprise of Sunday. And that's really what the breathing section is, just slowing it down and really beginning to go in. And I had to deal with a lot of unforgiveness. And that's where those 5 people, God taught me so much of unforgiveness and also having to forgive myself, and
Mm.
really just begin to just clean out my system to prepare my heart, mind, body, and soul for the surprise of Sunday.
Well, and what I love that you said earlier too is that forgiving, that breathing in, God's peace, his joy, all of that is it is a process, and oftentimes it's not like you just arrive at the other side, right? A lot of times it's something you have to do again and again and again, particularly when it comes to forgiveness. And so, I mean, is that what you found to be true? Is you're like, "Oh, I think I'm past this, and here we are again. I've got to kind of slow down, breathe it in, start
Yeah.
again."
Yeah. I mean, again, people might be angry for me for saying this, but there's not a Sunday that goes by that I don't think about something Bill taught me. I sit back at a service and I go, oh, that transition could have been so much better. And Bill would have told me that. Um, that teaching moment was really, really powerful. And Bill would have told me that. Like
Mm.
that, like, so I have these moments and it's almost like a both a fondness and a sadness,
Mhm. Yeah.
and that sadness of like, oh, and then I have to go through the process of, okay, I'm back in a little bit of Friday. It doesn't hurt as it once did, but I can move through it and just go, okay, just still continue to pray for him, can pray for the chance that someday reconciliation and repentance will happen, and we can we
Yep.
can talk that it all through. But it makes me slow it down to get back to I think a more Jesus kind of way of living.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to think through, a Jesus way of living. Yeah, we could talk about that, but we're going to close with this. The last step is receive, and you're really talking a lot about just receiving, being open to the lessons that God teaches you, to the healing that he provides. And so maybe share with us a surprise or a lesson that that you received during that time, maybe that you just didn't expect. Because I think that's true for all of us, and they're really easy to miss sometimes.
So in the grief journey, Friday is you're in grief. Saturday, you think you can get through the grief. So you're just trying to get through it as quick as possible. But on Sunday, if you think about it, post resurrection in John chapter 20, Jesus appears and Thomas wants to see his hands. And he shows his hands and he still has the scars. And I
Yeah.
think what that showed me was you go in grief, you go through grief. And then here's the thing Sunday, you're going to be with the grief, but you're just going to carry it differently.
Yeah.
And I think that's almost the surprise of the healing for some of us who lost a family member or a
Mhm.
relationship or a dream job or a church hurt. Like you get these moments where you're like, you're going to carry it, but you're just going to carry it differently as time goes on. I think the surprise, though, for me that I didn't see coming was we were living in Arizona. My son was in 8th grade. I asked my son, hey, bud, wherever you want to go to high school, I'm going to do whatever I can to not move us. So where
Mm.
would you like to go? And he goes, I want to go back home. I said, where?
Oh,
He's
Chicago.
like, our old neighborhood. I'm like,
Oh.
in Chicagoland? He's like, yeah, I want to go to Friend High School with my friends. And I'm like, okay, well, we're gonna let's pray about that. I'm like, there's no way this is
You're
gonna
like, "I'm
happen.
not sure I wanna
There's
go
no,
back
yeah,
there."
exactly. Who moves back to their personal Chernobyl, right? And I'm like, I have no idea. But as my wife and I started praying about it, and we started to really think about this, it was the right move.
Mm,
And I had read a book by Daniel Grothe called The Power of Place.
mm,
You look at all of the early church fathers and mothers. I mean, they in their name, Francis of Assisi,
mhm.
Teresa of Calcutta, like they had a place that they were called to. I think
Yeah.
we just find ourselves so in the church world, like, oh, it's your gifting. That's
Mm,
what you need to chase down. But there's a place. And I started to
mm.
read this book. I just started to weep. And I called my friend who wrote the book, Daniel, and he said, Steve, you're Steve of Chicagoland. And I just was like, okay. And so we came back, and it's
Wow.
been really, really beautiful in so many ways for my son. And it's also felt a little bit like the desert season, picking up pieces, helping people regain trust in the local church and really helping people who maybe had drifted. But God is doing an incredible,
I love
incredible
it.
work, which has been really powerful.
Wow. What a story that's not finished yet, but just I feel like the way that at least what I hear from you and the way you've handled it really has also helped a lot of people to probably experience trust again, because once trust is broken, like you said, once you feel like you've been tricked, particularly in the church, it can just be a really slow, long journey to see people come back around and begin to understand, like, this wasn't God who did this to me. This wasn't even the church. This was broken people
Yep.
who hurt us. And so I know people can get your book anywhere, but if they want to connect with you, where's the best place to do that?
Yeah, they can go to stevecarter.org or on Instagram, Twitter, Threads at Steve Ryan Carter is probably the easiest place.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for being here today, Steve, and sharing your story.
Thanks for having me on the Grace Enough podcast. It means the world.
Thank you for listening to the Grace Enough podcast. Tune in next time.